Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining our call today. I'll hand it over to Benjamin Alexander.
Thank you. Good morning and actually good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on the utilization of Unified Federal Review. I am Benjamin Alexander, and I work for FEMA's Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation. I serve as the Unified Federal Review National Coordinator. As federal agencies and those with delegated authority, it is our collective responsibility to coordinate respective environmental compliance reviews in a disaster recovery setting. This responsibility is known as UFR, Unified Federal Review, or more fully as Unified Federal Environmental and Historic Preservation Review from the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. So UFR collaboration is complicated. It takes time, takes a lot of energy, and it requires persistence, a lot of persistence. With understanding and patience and commitment, we, FEMA, HUD, responsible entities, other federal agencies, we can all collectively utilize the UFR process to deliver timely and effective support to our state and community stakeholders. So in today's webinar, you will hear background on UFR, approaches to implementing the UFR process, and a panel discussion on successful application of UFR in various communities. So thank you in advance for your participation today. Now let's get started. I'll hand it over to our Enterprise and Arcadis team to begin the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, everyone, for joining today on LEAP Day, an extra day just for us to learn a little bit more about UFR. So as Benjamin mentioned, I'm Orlando Velez, despite what you see on my name tag below, with Enterprise Community Partners. I lead the HUD grantee and local partners team with Enterprise Advisors, the mission-driven consulting department of Enterprise. And here with us today, we have Brian Schlossnagel, CPD, Program Environmental Clearance Officer, Disaster Recovery at the HUD headquarters. Josh Helms, Field Environmental Officer in the Boston Regional Office in Region 1. Kelly Warner, Field Environmental Officer, Disaster Recovery in the Fort Worth Regional Office, Region 6. Donna Mahone, Field Environmental Officer, Disaster Recovery, Connecticut, New Jersey, in the Newark Field Office in Region 2. I'm also joined today by my colleagues, Patrick Birdsong. Patrick is a program associate on my team, on the HUD grantee local partners team at Enterprise Community Partners with Enterprise Advisors. Seth Magden, the National Program Management Lead with Arcadis. He will be one of today's presenters along with Krista Jankowski, PhD, PG. She's a program planner with Arcadis. And Madison Playford, Senior Management Consultant with Arcadis. We also have a special guest today, David Camarena, Director of Environmental Oversight at the Texas General Land Office, to discuss their success story. We're really excited to hear more about him. So today's webinar is part of the Community Disaster Preparedness webinar series. It's designed to help HUD grantees, stakeholders, and partners tackle disaster recovery, boost community resilience, and handle environmental reviews with more efficiency. For more information, please follow the link, which I will post in just a moment, to the HUD Exchange to register for the future webinars. Today's webinar and all future webinars will be recorded and posted on HUD Exchange. If you registered for this webinar, you'll receive an email when the recording and the associated guide are posted on HUD Exchange. The chat feature for today's webinar will be disabled for participants. You will be able to see our responses to you through the chat. We'll put in a few important details in there. We do encourage you to send questions through the Q&A feature. So all questions will either be responded in the Q&A feature or live at the end of the presentation by one of our team members. We also encourage folks to put in best practices too into the Q&A feature. We don't want to just hear questions. We want to hear best practices that we can share with everyone else too at some point. If you have additional questions after this webinar, I'll send the email address in the chat feature, but it is Environmental Planning Division at HUD.gov. So today we'll leap into how the UFR process can make a big difference in disaster recovery projects. I will make puns throughout my presentation. We'll cover everything from how it helps streamline the whole recovery process to making things more efficient and effective for your projects. We'll also talk about meeting environmental and historic preservation, EHP rules, walk through the UFR process and the goals, and share a success story from the Texas GLO. So key learning objectives today are going to be understanding the importance of the UFR process, determining when it is necessary to apply, and understanding that what grantees should do to implement the UFR process. So I'll pass it now to Seth Magden to leap us with setting the stage for the UFR CWGDR grantees. Seth.
Thanks very much, Orlando. That's a tough act to follow. I don't know if I have that many puns in my repertoire, but yeah, the idea here today is again to provide some context and background and have something for everyone, no matter how long you've been involved in the recovery process. And so there's a great turnout today. Folks that have been involved in the recovery process, whether you're just getting started or you might be a seasoned grantee. But the idea, again, as Orlando said, this is the first in a series to support delivering recovery in quicker, faster, and more expedited fashion to the communities that need the support. And so we can move to the next slide, please, Patrick. So just backing up, and again, this might be kind of fundamental for a lot of folks, but understand there's different levels of experience in this field. We wanted to provide some overarching context and background about when HUD assistance is made available. So initially at the front end, right, there is some sort of significant damage event, disaster event. It could be a hurricane, tornado, wildfire, intense rainfall, yielding flooding, which is what we'll get into with a success story with David. But following that major disaster event that has created significant hardship for communities, that can then trigger a federally declared disaster. And so after that presidential declaration, then different entities could apply for federal assistance. And one of these, and this is something that HUD funding is often referred to as the funding of last resort, right? The Community Development Block Grant for Disaster Recovery is one of multiple funding sources that can be used to support community recovery to help fill those gaps. And so again, during this time in the UFR process, right, as we think about the actions that are taking place in the immediate post-disaster period, there are a lot of different stakeholders involved in different agencies. And so that's kind of what this presentation is about, is to provide that pathway to make a little bit of sense of what's going on to help move forward in the process in a more intentional way. And I do want to flag here on this initial slide, we've got throughout the presentation a number of, at the bottom of the slide, you might see the hyperlinks or different resource callouts. And as Orlando mentioned, these will be provided. The idea is that this slide deck will be a resource to you. And so we can move forward to the next slide, please, Patrick. So first, we're going to take a look at HUD environmental review requirements. So for HUD-assisted projects that require environmental review, the idea is that we are doing, we're helping the communities, right? We're not creating any additional hardships. And so the environmental review process is ensuring that these actions that are being undertaken with HUD-funded recovery projects and initiatives are honoring that stewardship of natural and cultural resources in partnership with local stakeholders and local governmental entities. And so what is unique in this case about HUD funding is that responsible entity is taking on that stewardship role and becomes that extension of HUD for these HUD-funded recovery projects and initiatives. And so some things that responsible entities should know is that that DR funding does share a number of environmental review requirements with other federal agencies, but there are also requirements that are unique to HUD and to using HUD funding, and that's outlined there in those links, as you see, for 24 CFR Part 51 and for HUD in particular, Part 58. And so these environmental reviews that the responsible entities are conducting, again, are important to ensure that the work that is taking place in the recovery process is creating that benefit for the community, and there are no unintended consequences or adverse environmental or health effects for communities. And so ensuring that the work that is taking place doesn't have any additional negative impacts. And again, just that resource highlight there at the bottom for FEMA's EHP regulations, just to note for future reference. Next slide, please. So what is the role of responsible entities, REs, in the environmental review process? So again, each federal agency has its own practitioner or folks that are involved in conducting reviews. And as mentioned, for HUD funding, this is unique in where the grantee does have that role of becoming an extension of HUD as the responsible entity. So REs then can conduct those environmental reviews for projects with DR funding, and they can act as the federal agency as authorized and where permitted by program legislation. And they should be treated in that same fashion. They should be treated accordingly by other federal agencies. So in this case, for responsible entities, they can participate with interagency coordination meetings. And again, that's what we're getting to as part of the UFR process, empowering those REs. They can serve as the cooperating or lead agency with the NEPA process as well. And in addition, HUD responsible entities can perform those consultations under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And so throughout this process, the RE is coordinating directly with their HUD counterparts, and HUD is supporting those responsible entities as a liaison. They're helping to connect the RE with other federal agency points of contact, developing that network, supporting through the development of specific memorandums of understanding, which again, we'll get to in the success story with David, and also establishing those procedures and SOPs about how data may be shared, how to coordinate most effectively to shorten the recovery timeline and expedite the delivery of projects and programs to communities. And so HUD will continue to provide, as evident today and why we're here, resources like the UFR trainings, tools, and mechanisms. So again, during the recovery process, there are a number of challenges that can be experienced. And I'm sure a number of folks on the call today have experienced some of these. And so understanding who the right points of contact are, having that network, this is frequently in the immediate aftermath, something where trying to understand who's responsible for what within each agency, can create some delays, right? So that is what this UFR process is about, is being proactive in establishing those points of contact. So without that coordination, right, significant time and resources can be spent that can create additional challenges working with each agency independently and transmitting the same information, the same data sets to different agencies can create those delays. And as we know, time is money. And with recovery and with HUD funds in particular, all the additional funds that are spent on transmitting the same data has a cost associated with it. And those are dollars that can be spent on recovery projects, right? And so one of the other challenges that we look at is that each of the federal agencies, they do have different missions and they have requirements they have to fulfill and uphold and things that are important to them. And so there are different sets of environmental regulations. This can also then translate to delays, which again, the delays for a community that's waiting for a recovery project to hit the ground, that can have a significant impact for communities. And so our goal and our role as practitioners in this field is to find those ways to expedite the process. In addition, with permitting processes as well, having different agencies involved can contribute to different types of delays in getting assistance to the communities in the field. Next slide, please. So real quick, we're going to sum up the challenge of the UFR process and the solution. So again, HUD has its own environmental review requirements. That can be a challenge when working with other federal agencies that have their own requirements and their own mission and methods. And so without the coordination, that can yield duplication of efforts and inconsistencies in the review process. And these can be avoided. And so that is where the UFR process comes in and presents the solution to create that pathway and opportunities for alignment at early stages and throughout the process to facilitate that coordination, communication, and ensure that at the local level for grantees that the responsible entity is set up for success in this process. And so just one note here on this slide too, this is, and we're going to hear again from David as a success story later in the presentation, but additional context, other responsible entities have noted that by engaging in this early coordination with scoping of projects, bringing the right stakeholders to the table from other federal agencies, helping to identify who's doing what, the roles and responsibilities, that contributes to expediting the delivery of a recovery project. And again, the communities that are waiting for the resources, waiting for the support, that has a big impact to them. So this is where I will transition over here and provide, and Madison Playford, my colleague, will provide a little more information on the background of UFR in the origin story.
Good afternoon. My name is Madison Playford, and I'm going to discuss the UFR process overview today. The UFR process was initially created because of the lessons learned following the Hurricane Sandy disaster. The UFR process was established to improve the efficiency of conducting environmental reviews for the disaster recovery projects. Hurricane Sandy was a significant event which many stakeholders and agencies were involved. As they often acted independently, there were challenges with them working together to efficiently respond to disasters and provide benefits to communities. Federal funding and permitting completed the same reviews without communicating results and progress with each other. Agencies submitted 2 or even 3 environmental studies assessment reports for the same project. Instead, the agencies could have coordinated to complete one environmental review or possibly adopted each other's reviews. The Stafford Act was amended to establish an expedited and unified interagency review process to ensure compliance with the environmental and historic requirements under federal law relating to disaster recovery projects to expedite the recovery process consistent with applicable law. Right, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. The UFR process was formalized through an interagency memorandum of understanding, which will be referred to as MOU from here on out. The MOU was executed on July 29th, 2014, and signatory agencies committed to supporting the UFR process. Since HUD is a signatory to the MOU, responsible entities can benefit from the use of the UFR to expedite the review under Part 58. The MOU outlines roles and responsibilities to the 11 federal departments and agencies involved in environmental assessment requirements associated with disaster recovery. The first link on this page will provide more information about the agencies under the 11 signatory departments and how they are involved in environmental review. For example, the Bureau of Land Management and National Park Service have been instrumental in developing tools and resources that guide the process. Right. And on the next slide, we're going to see a visual representation of the agencies involved. Some are the Department of Transportation, the EPA, Department of Commerce, and Agriculture, just to name a few. It is also important to note that while responsible entities are not required to use UFR, they can greatly benefit when they do. And next, we'll move into the goals of the UFR process. The goals of the UFR process are to improve coordination among federal agencies and state, local, tribal, and territorial authorities, enhancing federal agencies' ability to expedite and streamline environmental reviews for disaster recovery, ensuring consistency and collaboration among agencies conducting reviews, to provide a framework for interagency communication, and to reduce delays and duplication efforts to expedite recovery and get the benefits to the communities who need them the most. Next, we'll move into what the UFR does and does not do. So the UFR does encourage the development of disaster-specific agreements for streamlined benefits to applicants. It reduces paperwork by facilitating organization coordination and minimalizing duplication of information. It enhances working relationships and coordination across agencies and simplifies information retrieval by coordinating agency responses to inquiries. The UFR process does not establish a single review process for multiple agencies funding a single project. It does not alter existing regulations or interagency agreements, and it does not guarantee approval or funding from FEMA or any other federal agency grant programs. Great, and I'll hand it off to my colleague, Krista.
Great, thank you, Madison. So I am going to be speaking with y'all today about some of the UFR best practices or tips and tricks on how to get the most out of this process. So as you've heard throughout this presentation so far, one of the biggest benefits to using the Unified Federal Review process as a HUD responsible entity is really the ability to be connected to others involved in the environmental review process and to leverage those relationships to strengthen communication and to streamline the process. So the first best practice that we really want to highlight today is making those connections early in the disaster recovery process. This can even happen during steady state conditions when there isn't the urgency of an active disaster recovery effort and you have the time to really start making those connections. As a responsible entity, you can reach out to HUD, regional or field environmental officers to support identifying and reaching out to relevant points of contact at other federal agencies, as well as to determine and do that to determine a coordinated approach with regard to the overall environmental review process. The link at the bottom of this slide is going to help you to identify those REOs or FEOs that can support you in your review preparation and during the process. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about another way to start your environmental review off on the right footing, and that's really by planning ahead while keeping environmental review in mind. When a project is in its planning stages, it really benefits everyone to think about how that project can be designed to either avoid or mitigate negative environmental impacts to both the project area and the surrounding community. So as a responsible entity, you can benefit from the strategic planning of that project and thinking about how to minimize those environmental impacts from the start. And then the recovery aid recipients benefit as well from a more timely completion of the environmental review process that then ultimately leads to quicker recovery. On the next slide, we can see that as a signatory to the Interagency Memorandum of Understanding that established UFR, HUD is really committed to undertaking broad UFR coordination activities. So examples of those would be establishing agreements to and work processes that would guide the environmental review process for the project. And another best practice that we want to highlight is for REs to be involved in interagency coordination activities, particularly those that are related to the information sharing that occurs during the process, and to get involved with that as early as possible in order to take full benefit from the sharing and the collaboration with other federal agencies during the process. Resources are available online for REs to look at related to interagency meeting checklists and frameworks for communication. And those are available to sort of help you navigate coordination efforts more effectively. Next, we're going to discuss what we think is one of the key best practices for REs when conducting UFR, which has to do with organizing and sharing data amongst the group of federal agencies involved in the disaster recovery project. The information or the environmental review process, it's really important for documenting compliance with federal regulations, of course, and for ensuring that HUD-supported projects are meeting agency goals of providing safe and healthy living conditions for residents and folks affected by those projects. And because of that, the environmental review process needs to document all these things. So that review process produces a lot of data and a lot of different documents that need to be organized, maintained, and also shared out with a variety of entities throughout the process. By following those data sharing agreements that can be created early on in the UFR process, responsible entities can better ensure that maps, consultations, reviews, permit histories, and the many other types of information that are produced through this are handled properly and shared with the folks who need to see it. Another benefit to the responsible entities is that with good record keeping amongst the federal agency actors during the review process, everyone can then avoid the duplication of efforts and avoid wasted time and resources and get that process done more efficiently. On the next slide, we see that responsible entities are responsible for determining project compliance with all HUD environmental requirements that are outlined in Part 58. So this includes the HUD-specific environmental criteria that are listed here and standards, and these are standards that other agencies may not have. So standards and criteria around noise abatement, around the siting of projects near hazardous materials, or around runways and airfields. So it's best practice for responsible entities to communicate these HUD-specific requirements to other federal agencies, which may not be aware of them. And RE should also discuss the environmental review requirements of the cooperating federal agencies to outline all overlapping and unique requirements and to coordinate fulfilling them across the board. So next, it's important to know that when appropriate, responsible entities may benefit from leveraging the efforts of other agencies and adopting another agency's environmental review. Now, it is the responsible entity's responsibility to verify that the scope of work being performed by both agencies is the same before doing so, before adopting that review. But when it is possible, this enhances the efficiency in completing that environmental review and can, again, streamline that process and get recovery dollars spent and benefiting folks more efficiently. On the next slide, just want to sort of summarize some of those unique benefits the UFR process provides or can provide for you as a HUD responsible entity. So through the best practices that we just discussed, HUD responsible entities are able to meet the environmental review responsibilities while benefiting from leveraging federal agency resources, so gaining access to shared data and basically increasing capacity by being targeted and strategic in how they're coordinating. And that can directly result from employing those agreements that we talked about, the data sharing agreements, and coordinating and communicating really early and often throughout the process. There can also be a reduction in redundancy. So when information is organized and clearly communicated, responsible entities are able to avoid duplication of efforts and kind of move the process along more effectively. And then finally, when we're not recreating work that's already been done and we're able to work more efficiently, those resources of time and effort and money can be reallocated and can directly lead to things like earlier implementation of the disaster recovery efforts, which will then benefit those residents. The next section that I'm going to talk about is really looking at the tools and mechanisms that can support responsible entities in the UFR process. And so I really want to point out that first resource, the one that we've marked with the gold star, the UFR library. This is a link that will take you to basically a treasure trove of online information regarding different tools and mechanisms that can be used to support the UFR process. And that UFR library will host a large number of resources to help with coming up with those data sharing agreements or understanding who points of contact at different federal agencies may be, and answering a lot of questions that you may have as a responsible entity. And so we have that resource as well as the ones below it, and then 2 additional slides of resources that we're just going to click through. I'm not going to go through each of these today because it's better use of the time for you to take the time to click on some of these resources, but really just want to say that there are a lot of resources online available to you, and that you should take the time to check those out once you have these slides in hand. So that's it for me. So I am going to go ahead and hand it back over to my colleague Seth, and he's going to help to facilitate our conversation about a success story using UFR. So Seth.
Thanks very much, Krista. And again, so this has been pretty academic so far, right? Understanding, what the UFR process is, where it comes from, MOUs, and lots of maybe some new acronyms for folks. And that's part of our goal also, is to help expand your lexicon in the disaster recovery space. But to make this real and to look at an actual use case, and relatively soon after the UFR process came online, we have here with us, joining us from Texas today, Mr. David Camarena from the GLO. And so I want to welcome David. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Seth. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And just quickly, again, I'm with the environmental oversight team with the Texas General Land Office, Community Development and Revitalization. And we're happy to be invited to discuss a Texas success story with the UFR process. But briefly, a little bit about the GLO CDR. We are responsible for administering HUD DR and mitigation funds for numerous federally declared disasters. For these, Congress appropriated Texas approximately $10.6 billion. And with those funds, the GLO administers programs and projects throughout the eligible disaster areas to help Texans recover from disasters. What I will be discussing with respect to the UFR is the Deweyville ISD Elementary Relocation Project. Here, HUD funds associated with the 2016 floods allocation help the community with its long-term recovery efforts by reconstructing the elementary school outside of the floodplain. So to provide a little backstory, Deweyville, a small town in Far East Texas with a population of about 1,000, was still trying to recover from a impact of a major 2015 flood, which is a separate HUD allocation, when the 2016 springtime brought massive amounts of rainfall to the region again. The nearby Sabine River reached levels unseen in a generation, and water poured into town, causing catastrophic damage to homes, schools, and businesses. As the floodwaters receded over the following weeks, one of the costliest casualties was the town's elementary school, which was a total loss to the school district and community. The Deweyville Elementary Relocation Project was one of those great projects that initially provided challenges for the subrecipient and the small rural community, from locating a project site outside of a special flood hazard area to coming up with funds to reconstruct the school, and also dealing with more torrential rains in 2017, but this time associated with Hurricane Harvey. Jump to 2018, the ISD applied for a FEMA public assistance grant, which would cover 75% of the $12 million it would take to reconstruct the elementary school outside of the floodplain. The GLO administered HUD DR funds would be used as a local match to cover the rest of the cost. The FEMA Environmental and Historic Preservation Office received the project shortly thereafter, and this initiated a series of meetings with the GLO and HUD to coordinate the UFR project review process. This was extremely useful for identifying environmental and historic preservation issues and other information needs, also with setting up timelines and ensuring responsibilities were met. For this UFR project, FEMA served as the lead federal agency, and for the HUD Part 58 side, the GLO was the responsible entity, and HUD served as a support function and advisor. A single EA was completed as part of the UFR process to expedite the project completion. And sometime in the summer of 2018, FEMA issued a FONSI, and the GLO adopted the environmental review, completed the RO process with HUD. Utilizing the UFR process with the GLO key partners has helped expedite and streamline several environmental reviews, and has also provided other benefits to GLO and its subrecipients, including this Deweyville ISD project. The most tangible benefit, in my opinion, is the reduction of staff workload and expenditure of HUD funds for the completion of the environmental review. The GLO, as RE, did not have to utilize vendor support or designate a staff member or team to complete an ERR. Also, any special environmental studies associated with a UFR project, such as an archaeological or biological survey or a wetland delineation, would have been completed by the lead agency, which in this case was FEMA. This has equated to time and funds saved that could be used to serve more Texas communities. Also, this Deweyville Elementary Relocation Project provided another net benefit. During the work of the environmental review, FEMA, HUD, and GLO realized we could benefit from a formal agreement concerning UFR. So by using the National UFR MOU as a tiering off point, the three agencies finalized a UFR letter of agreement in early 2020. This agreement has been used to coordinate UFR environmental and historic preservation reviews for disaster recovery projects associated with Hurricane Harvey and other events too. The UFR agreement with FEMA, HUD, and GLO has been beneficial for laying out the framework for the three agencies to unify and expedite the environmental reviews for disaster recovery and mitigation process. And finally, we couldn't emphasize more that communication with your federal counterparts is key. That really helped us out. Find out who your FEMA and HUD UFR contacts are early on and build that rapport. Our Region 6 Mitigation Division contact, Sarah Carino, and HUD Regional and Field Officers David Storms and Kelly Warner have been a tremendous help and a great resource. They're fantastic, I do admit, and we're very lucky. After all, we have a similar mission in supporting recovery for our communities that have experienced disasters. For Deweyville, the UFR translated to expediting the recovery process in order for students and their families to have their elementary school reconstructed outside of the floodplain, thereby providing a more resilient community. And also our UFR letter of agreement is on our GLO CDR Environmental Toolkit website. Feel free to check it out. Seth, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. No, this is it's really great to see a use case in action, in particular with a school. And as you noted, this is a small rural community, right? And so that makes a big difference for small communities. Obviously, for larger communities as well, but for a community of that size and that nature, having that hub and making decisions about where where families might be able to return to, and thinking with their kids in mind, this had a significant impact for that community. And one thing I think here also, this is in part a success story, with using CDBGDR funds as match programs, and probably a lot of the folks tuned in today are contemplating or have match programs underway. And I wanted to ask, and so understanding that the disaster event occurred in the 2015-16 timeline, and so then the allocations made. So thinking back to the slide that we saw earlier, in understanding that an action plan is developed, right? And how early in the process did you guys get involved with FEMA, or if you recall, at what stage did you guys get involved with having some of those conversations with your stakeholders?
It was fairly early. I did come on with the GLO around mid-2018, so I wasn't on board just yet concerning the state action plan. But I do, again, kind of remember that it was fairly early. I mean, we knew that the subrecipient, in this case, Deweyville ISD, was on the verge or had applied. And once we knew that, then we were then working with our federal counterparts to figure out how this was going to work out, because in that application, they had already identified that they were going to be utilizing FEMA funds. So that early, we were already, we had already started thinking about the process, or the UFR process.
Right, and one thing I know you had mentioned in prior conversations just about the Deweyville ISD in terms of their I guess role as in needing that support, and where GLO supported and acted on their behalf. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how that worked?
As far as them needing support, I'm sorry?
Yeah, just in terms of you in the GLO acting on behalf of ISD. ISD is not necessarily a unified or a unit of local government in and of itself, right?
Correct. That's right. So the ISD is not a unit of general local government. So with that, they could not qualify as a responsible entity and take on that role for the environmental review. So the GLO stepped up to that responsibility, and working with the community, we were able to complete that environmental review with FEMA, obviously, and that helped expedite that process, because a lot of the times these smaller communities, they don't have a understanding of that role and responsibility. And sometimes them just getting that started, the environmental portion of it, can take some time. But with the GLO stepping in, I think that did help out expedite the process.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, David. And recalling the timeline of events, when was, I guess, the ribbon cutting for the new Deweyville school in the recovery process?
If I remember correctly, it was, I think, early 2020.
which again, for a lot of folks on this call and understanding the trajectory of recovery programs, that's really pretty quick, especially, you know, involving on the FEMA PA side, you know, the development of project worksheets and so forth, and using funds together, that in HUD funding being the funding of last resort to come in and fill the gaps, that's moving pretty quickly. And that's really the goal, why we're talking about UFR, right? How to serve communities better, faster, quicker. So, but this is super helpful to see this use case, David, and thank you for sharing that with everyone.
No, thank you, and I'm happy to be here.
Okay. Well, to summarize, we can move into the next slides here. So again, this is, as we just saw, what are the benefits, right? Streamlining the process, getting the stakeholders together early. Maybe this occurs during action plan development, or once an allocation's been identified, to begin those conversations, thinking with the end in mind, those community benefits that we can deliver quicker and faster. So again, reducing that workload for grantees, reducing paperwork, saving money, dollars that can be spent on additional nails and sheetrock and reconstructing houses. So every dollar saved on administrative processes translates to more work happening in the field. Again, the UFR process is about that coordination, about identifying the pathways for data sharing, where data is stored, how data moves, who has access to data, getting that process hammered out pretty early can yield those long-term benefits. And again, UFR supports the disaster recovery needs while ensuring that all environmental review actions and requirements are being met across agencies, and that the work that is taking place in the disaster recovery process is truly providing the benefit, and that no additional potential negative ramifications are realized as a result of that process. So thank you very much, and I will turn it back over to Orlando.
Thanks, Seth. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to ask panelists to please turn on the cameras if they can for this portion of today's event. We have a couple of questions that came in through the Q&A. If I would encourage folks, attendees, to please submit their questions through the Q&A, and our panelists are here to discuss. But there were a couple of them on here that I think I can read that will be beneficial to say out loud. We had one question about the Department of Transportation's ER and what that looks like when doing the UFR for HUD. Excuse me, the Department of Transportation has their own, and what it looks like when doing the UFR covering with the DOT, or would the entity have to adopt the DOT's ER or redo it? If somebody would
This
like.
is Donna Mahan. I was getting ready to, and I was having a little bit of issues trying to get myself there. So let me turn my camera on.
Thank you, Donna.
Hi. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. As far as the question relates in the adoption of the DOT review. So, oh, sorry, I just got a little note. We have under the UFR in itself does not actually allow for the adoption of another agency review. For the DOT in particular, you would not, HUD responsible entity would not be able to adopt that environmental review for a DOT project unless it was under some specific section of the Stafford Act, which is unusual for DOT projects. You can supplement it. Our responsible entity for using a DOT review could take a lot of that information, but it would have to be supplemented with our HUD requirements, go through the public notice requirements, and go through our process for getting a request for release of funds. There are opportunities for adopting reviews without any additional HUD supplementation or public notice, and that is when it's mostly mostly FEMA reviews, applies to specific sections of the Stafford Act, And if an environmental review and a project is funded under those specific sections of the Stafford Act, that review can be adopted. That usually applies to the local match requirements. So that review can be adopted without any HUD supplementation, doesn't require any public notice, and only requires a request for release of funds. And the other requirements for that is that that project scope must be substantially the same in order for that to apply. So if you have a project scope that's substantially the same as the FEMA review, it falls under those specific sections of the Stafford Act, which is like, I'm not going to be able to cite them off the top of my head, but we could put them in the chat if you like. But there's also going to be a webinar on May 2nd, from what I understand, for adoption of another agency's review, where there'll be more discussion on this and the difference between adopting a FEMA review under the Stafford Act provisions or adopting a review when there are no Stafford Act provisions or funds involved. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Donna. We appreciate that.
Welcome.
And yes, we'll be going over all the other webinars that are part of this series just after this. We have another question about UFR agreements. How does UFR agreement work with already established or existing programmatic agreements? And I think this might be a good question to hear also, David, if you've had this situation come Texas GLO during your for some of the projects.
How does it affect established or existing programmatic agreements? Well, the Texas General Office does have existing ones, one with SHPO and also with GLO Coastal also for consistency reviews. But how that affects it, I would say it doesn't really affect it at all, in my opinion. It complements each other, and if I guess it would depend. If we were the lead agency, then we would be using those agreement documents. But if FEMA is the lead agency in this UFR process, then I'm sure they have their own agreements that they utilize.
Thank you, David. We have a few more questions coming through. How would an organization get started with providing these emergency response services for the local communities?
Yeah, I'm not sure. How would an organization, is that the question, Orlando? Get involved?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
thinking from a, yeah. Go
I
ahead.
think this is coming from a not a government entity, but it looks like a community-based organization.
Yeah, is it possible to get a little bit more details regarding that question so that way we can ensure that we are hitting the intent?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Angus Fisher if they could please provide a little more details, or if they're even willing to ask the question live. I'm happy to unmute them. It is a CBO. We had a few more questions coming through from Brandon Jensen. Are there any efforts to allow consultation efforts with other interested parties to be considered for both agencies' ER processes? Or do consultations have to be conducted separately for each, specifically for those consultations required under Section 106?
Yeah, regarding the consultation process, I think it's always a good opportunity to bring individuals together as early as possible that has a stake in the overall process. I think kind of taking the 30,000 view of UFR and the overall intent is really to create teams that are efficient and streamlining. And part of that is building communication and collaboration. So if there are different elements such as Section 106 that could be explored with SHPOs, it could be useful for agencies under the UFR to have those discussions in order to determine more efficient paths. So having those early conversations can be a useful tool.
Thanks,
Brian, this is
Brian.
Donna. Can I add in that as well, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. I would just add that, some of those early consultations, and part of the UFR process may be coming to an agreement on whether there should be a cooperating agency, joint effort for preparing an environmental review. So if that consultation is, so if there are two funding sources and there's a shared project goal, and outcome there, and there needs to be two separate processes, it might be a worthwhile opportunity as part of that consultation to think about formalizing a cooperative agency process to satisfy both agencies' environmental review responsibilities.
Yeah, I'll second that, Donna, that we've had several projects in Texas and Louisiana where we had, HUD, FEMA, and the HUD responsible entity all on the same phone call with the SHPO. So it's not uncommon to kind of, in one go, put all your eggs in one basket and hit all the major parties at one time, especially for some of those complicated Section 106 issues that we've had in like Louisiana, for instance.
And this not only applies to Section 106, it's for other laws as well. So if there's an endangered species consultation that might be required, you could work together with the Fish and Wildlife Service or with the National Marine Fisheries Service to make a cooperative agreement. In those situations that we mentioned, though, it's important to note that there may be different scopes for each agency. So in those cases, you do want to make sure whoever is leading that consultation has the largest scope so that it includes the rest of everyone else's scope involved. So don't assume that you can adopt that or work with someone. Make sure that everything that is part of the HUD project is included in those other reviews. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. There's one more question about being prepared. How proactive can HUD REs be before a presidential declaration is actually announced? What will be the recommended steps? Seth or Krista?
Yeah. I mean, I think Krista mentioned, during the process, the earlier the better, right? And the best time to repair your roof is when the sun's out. So I won't take credit for that. I think that maybe it was JFK that said that. But at any rate, I think that the idea is that this coordination. So if the disaster event, or if there's no disaster event, again, understanding that a number of grantees are experiencing successive, and staff may move and shift and change. Before the disaster is declared, presidential declaration is made, and before Congress is allocating funds in different ways, right? Those conversations can begin. You can have those conversations without a disaster and establish those networks, understanding who your counterpart would be. So there's no wrong time to do it. But if there is a disaster event that has been experienced at the local level, obviously the immediate needs are the response, but the folks that are typically working on environmental review, are not involved in that immediate disaster response effort. So those conversations can certainly begin early on in the process. It's also probably advantageous as grantees are thinking about, within action plan development and specific types of programs that they might be running during that time frame as well. Contemplating the types of projects that may be undertaken during action plan development, I think would probably be an ideal time as well. But I think, the earlier the better. And I'll pause there if others have input.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Seth said there. It's never too early, and most programmatic or process procedural documents are developed when there's not a disaster, because you're going to be doing things way too quickly and thinking about other stuff during your recovery effort. So anytime you have the chance to document possible expedited processes with any consulting agency or with another federal agency, that's certainly a good time to do it. And one thing to think about, as Seth said, what are the types of projects that you might face? So that's what you want to be thinking about when you're having those discussions in the steady state. What things you want to try to expedite? Are you experiencing flooding, or are you experiencing hurricanes, wind? So think about what the projects would be that you want to try to push through. How many things would be similar in that sense?
Great. Thank you, everybody. I think those are all the questions that we have now. So as a reminder, today's webinar and all future webinars will be recorded and posted on Hot Exchange. If you registered for this webinar, you should be receiving an email when the recording and associated guide are posted on Hot Exchange. If you have any additional questions, you can send them to the Environmental Planning Division at hud.org.gov, and I will share that. We hope to see you at the next webinar. Please register through the HUD Exchange. The link in webinar series will also be shared in the chat feature now. This concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you.